Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the FANAC Fan History Project and its Zoom sessions, which are coordinated by Edie Stern. I'm Joe Siclari, and all I'm here for is to kibitz a little and ask a few questions. Our panelists are Jerry Kaufman in the upper left from my group. Andy Porter and Steve Rosenstein are in the screen together, and Moshe Feder. These guys have lived in New York, sometimes forever, and one has left. Want to welcome all of you here. Each of them, as we answer questions, will be giving some background. Most of you probably already know them, so I'm not going to give an individual bio. And we will get started pretty quickly. What I'm going to do is the first question we're going to ask is a pretty general question, and it's start with, how did you get involved in New York fandom? And Jerry, since you're the one expatriate, can you start?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Cleveland. My first convention, I got interested in science fiction because I found books in the library and they fascinated me. My first convention was in Cleveland. It was the 1966 World Convention. And Andy Porter is one of two people that I met there who are still around. The other one is Samuel R. Delaney. I attended the Nikon the next year, 67, and liked it. And when I graduated from university, I moved to New York. That was the summer of 1971. Had a place waiting for me with Eli Cohen, who I had met at some regionals, and David Emerson, his roommate. I had a big enough apartment to include me. And I lived in New York, different places, until the end of the summer of 1977, during which time Suzanne Tompkins and I published a fanzine called The Spanish Inquisition. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Jerry, I didn't realize that you had arrived so recently when I met you. Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Yeah. Well, and yet, did it seem like I had been a New Yorker for a while?
I do. I mean, I knew you were from out of town, but I just accepted that you were part of the New York scene, and I didn't think about it.
Oh.
Refugee from Cleveland Heights.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's
okay.
Right. I was, yes.
Andy, you were around probably the longest. Why don't you tell us how you got into fandom, and we'll get into the 70s in a little bit.
All right. I made a bad reputation for myself as the phone fan. This was in the late 1950s. I was living in the Bronx, and I would look in the phone book and see these science fiction writers' names, and I'd call them up. And because my name was at the time Silverberg, they thought I was Robert Silverberg's younger brother or something like that. And so these pros would pick up the phone and talk to me and say, "Who the heck is this?" And eventually I called up Don Wollheim, and Wollheim said, "What you need is fandom." And he gave me the name and phone number of Frank Dietz, who was the head of the Lunarians, and Ted White, who was head of the Fanoclasts. And Ted White decided I was too neo-ish to go to Fanoclasts, but the Lunarians welcomed me with open arms. So my first fan meeting was, I think, sometime in 1960 or 61.
How old were you then?
I was like 14, 15.
Oh, wow.
And then I went to the open ESPA meetings in, you see this? Open ESPA meetings in Newark, New Jersey.
Yep.
In 1661, and et cetera. And then I started going, my first other convention was Lunacon in, I think, 61. And here's a my book, 65 Lunacon. Show and tell, folks. And then I joined Fanoclasts in 64. And I've been going to Milford Prep School and started a fanzine called Elgol back then. It was 2 pages dittoed poorly. And I have copies here, but because I'm crowded in with Steve, I'm not going to show you stuff. Anyway, so started Elgol in '63 when I was at Milford Academy. And that became 2 pages and 8 pages and 10 pages, and then had a cover, and eventually became spirit duplicated, mimeographed, and offset. And there was a Cuban refugee who had a tabletop offset press, and I was doing Algo, I think 250 copies. And he said, I said, how much for 1,000? He said, $28 more. And I thought, oh, good, I can print 1,000. How am I going to get rid of them? I could sell them, and it's the road to hell. Is paid with great intention. But meanwhile, I was in APA F, which was a Fistfa and Fanoclast APA, of which APA L in California is an offshoot. And I had a fanzine. I had a fanzine called Zegler, which I did for APA F. And in '66, when we were in the Fanoclast and bidding for New York for '67, I did sort of a newzine-ish copy of it. And Jerry Kaufman, who has so much to answer for, it's incredible. The chains on that man, Marley. He said, wow, this is really good. You should do a news scene like this. And I thought, wow. And eventually I started, Degler became a news zine, eventually became SF Weekly. And in 1968, I was working at Lancer Books, and I lost my job, and I ceased publication of SF Weekly. And 3 weeks later, the first issue of Locust came out. And so the rest is some malignant sort of history. I don't know. Weird, just strange. What might have been, as they say in the trade.
Okay, Steve.
Yeah, I guess I represent the Star Trek branch of New York fandom. I got involved because a friend dragged me down to a protest in front of NBC when they were going to cancel Star Trek after the 2nd season. And at the protest, we met a number of Lunarians, I think including Deborah Langsom, Lee Smorey, and a bunch of the other names that escape me right now. And she said, well, you know, if you're science fiction fans and Star Trek fans, you might enjoy the local science fiction group. So she gave me the name of the Lunarians, and I contacted Frank, I think it was, or what was his wife's name? Ann?
Ann Dietz.
Yes.
Ann Dietz, yeah.
Originally, that was his second wife. His first wife was Belle Dietz, who was involved in fandom going back into the 40s and the 50s.
Yeah, well, anyhow, Ann gave me the directions to her house in New Jersey. I was living on Long Island with a car at that time, so we drove to the first meeting, really enjoyed the atmosphere and the people that we met, and became part of Lunarians at that point. And I gaffeated it about '82, so I don't have much history after that. But during the time that I was there, that's where the Star Trek conventions branched off of, because we were Lunarians, and we went to the Lunicons. And I won't bore you with the background detail, but anyhow, we decided we were going to hold a convention for maybe 300 of our closest Star Trek fans at the Statler Hilton, and it turned out that about 3,000 showed up. And we said, you know, this is, yeah, Moshe, you were there. And this was, we thought, oh, maybe we have more than we realized. So it was a 5-year run. And at the end of the 5-year mission, we closed it down, and that's my history.
Okay, we'll talk. I'm sure we'll talk more about that.
Weirdly, just by coincidence, Steve moved to Brooklyn. He moved to the building next to mine. I'm at 55, and he was at 59, and then he's eventually moved all the way across the street to 60. So he's literally across the street. So when I came over just now, it took me like 33 seconds to cross the street and go in the lobby and out the elevator to his house. It's just weird.
A very good circumstance in the current situation. So
Yeah.
Okay, Moshe, why don't you tell us your
Okay.
experience?
Well, I've been reading science fiction for as long as I could read, but I didn't know about fandom because I was a cheapskate and didn't want to buy the magazines. I felt that a book would be a better bet, a better, return on my investment, so to speak, and that the magazines would be, less reliable. It wouldn't, if something hadn't made it into book form, it probably wasn't as good. So that was my logic at the time with my limited budget. And as a result, I didn't really find out about fandom until I was in Israel in the summer of 1969. And I bought a copy of Amazing, and it had the Clubhouse column in it by John Barry. And that's where I discovered fandom and fanzines. And then when I got to college, I started a science fiction club, and a couple of the people who came had, some real knowledge of fandom and of conventions. The crucial person there was Charlene Komar, who co-edited and published Rats with Bill Kunkel, and who was, part of the circle, the insurgent circle around Arnie and Joyce Katz in Brooklyn Heights. So thanks to her, Barry Smotroff and I got invited to the insurgents. It must be the only case of anybody being an insurgent before being a Fanoclast. And of course, this prejudiced me against Lunarians because, insurgents had a very high opinion of themselves. It wasn't a perfect fit for that group. I couldn't make it over for the pre-meeting dinners because I had to have Friday night dinner with my family. And also everybody was getting stoned after dinner and I wasn't smoking dope then. But it was great to meet them. I met John Barry there, which was pretty exciting after his having introduced me to fandom. And then the other thing that happened was Barry had the idea of contacting other groups at other schools in the area. And as a result, we started going to the meetings of the Columbia group. And so we met Jerry and Eli and David Emerson and Suzel eventually, and so on. So, altogether that, pretty quickly wove me into the web of New York fandom, such as it was. And then eventually, I can't remember who invited me. Somebody got me an invitation to go down to Steve Stiles' house in South Brooklyn, where Fanoclasts was held at the time. And I can still remember admiring his filing cabinets, which were full of...
Which at one time had been Ted White's apartment.
Yeah, that's right. Now, later on, there was another meeting in that area. Fistfa moved to the apartment of Ross Chamberlain and Hank Davis, which was in the same part of Brooklyn. So we spent a lot of time going in there and coming back. But anyway, eventually, I stopped being a guest in Fanoclasts. I became a member of Fanoclasts and a snob to the rest of them. And here we are.
Okay, well, you guys mentioned a number of people already, but who are the ones who are actually doing the things around New York when you guys got started in the early 70s?
Doing what thing?
What? Which?
Whether it was running clubs, publishing fanzines, doing conventions, who was doing what?
Well, Lunarians was doing the regular Lunacon. That was the main convention at the time. And I attended it every year, and I even worked on it once or twice. There was one year when we had a game show at the convention that I was responsible for. Steve was carrying on the Fanoclast tradition, even though Ted White probably felt it wasn't completely legitimate at that point.
He definitely did not think it was legitimate. He said Fanoclasts was over when I left.
Yeah,
I can
Essentially, I'm not quoting exact words here, but yeah.
And
so, yeah.
Charlie Brown was up in the Bronx publishing Locus, and lots of people would go over to his place to collate the issues when it was still Mimeo. And for some reason, I never went. I don't know if I felt I had to be invited or what, but I never went. So as a result, I never really had much of a relationship with Charlie. And he always seemed to ignore me when he was, later on when I was working in publishing. Maybe that's why.
So, Chris, I was in that I wasn't a student at Columbia, but Eli and David were, I'm not sure how Fistfa, which was the name of the Columbia, the short form of the Columbia Club, how people were or were not official members of it, but it was called Fistfa, which stood for Fantasy and Science Fiction Society at Columbia University.
Yeah.
And Fred Lerner was one of the main people in that. I think he might have started it. And he can attest to that because he's on this Zoom. I saw Janet and Ricky Kagan, who lived over in New Jersey and who bred cats whose kittens always ended up in other fan homes. We were a major part. Eli and Janet had been publishing a fanzine called ACOS, but by the time I moved there, I think that was when Eli had started his own zine, Kratophany, a word that I think he learned from Sandra Miesel, which meant a show of power.
That sounds plausible.
Yeah, it's all plausible. We used to go out to Chinese, specifically a Chinese restaurant, which I think was called Chuan Hung on Broadway, where people would dash next door to get beer, because you could bring in beer. You couldn't buy it in the restaurant, but you could bring it in from elsewhere. And where Elliot Shorter and several other people, I think Ricky, had essentially competitions of who could eat the hottest peppers.
Yeah. Elliot was definitely one of our local BNFs because he was a past winner of TAP, and one of the few prominent African American fans in fandom as a whole. And he was delightful. He's one of the few people I would let use the Yiddish version of my name.
So the other thing that we started, Susan moved in '72. And she moved into the Avocado Pit as well. Oh, the Avocado Pit, that was the name of the apartment that Eli and David had named it, because Eli kept growing avocados from pits, and then the cats that they had would eat them. But we did, I don't remember when I started going up to Charlie and Dina Brown was Dina Benetton when we first knew her. She was part of Suzel's Pittsburgh group, which is why why we got invited up to Alcoa. Yeah. Dina and Charlie met a year or two.
Editor and in South Africa, still around.
Oh, yes. Yes, she's on my friends list. I have no idea if she's on this call, but I see Linda Bushhager is. Hi, Linda. So anyway, we went up, and it was a group of people who are kind of borderline. Some of them were borderline or definitely professionals, and some of us were fans. And that, for instance, that's the way that Ginger Buchanan eventually became a professional editor, because David Hartwell was often one of the collators, and he got her to work on his little magazine, which was called The Little Magazine. He kind of helped her get into publishing. Anyway, that's enough from me for now.
Well, it's worth mentioning, since you mentioned Ginger and Hartwell, that one of the things that distinguished Fanoclasts from the other groups was that it had a tradition of having Spanish pros or pro-ish fans as members, and people who, if they weren't in publishing yet, aspired to be in publishing. And a lot of us indeed ended up doing that, including me, Hank Davis and Ginger, as you mentioned, and Gary Farber. And of course, we had John Douglas, who ended up editing at Avon.
The Hoffman also was in Fanoclasts.
Yes, or before my time, but yeah. So that was one of the things that distinguished us from Lunarians, I kind of felt. And the other thing was Lunarians, because they had a convention, they were a more formal organization. They were actually incorporated and so on. And Fanoclasts didn't have business meetings. We just had conversations. And after Fanoclasts, or Fistfa for that matter, we would often go to Chinatown, and in that case, the Chinatown
is the Fistfa, Fannish Informal Science Fiction Association.
I thought it was Fannish Insurgent Scientific Association. Okay, anyway, informal sounds good. Anyway, we used to go down to Wohop in Chinatown, which is the second oldest Chinese restaurant in the city. And it's open to, at least it was open then 24/7. So we could go there at, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And something I always look forward to and I still enjoy on the rare occasions that I get there.
Well, they were just awarded some, I think I sent you most the article. They received the city award or something.
Yes.
Really? Oh, I don't know if I saw that.
It was Times.
Okay.
Yeah.
The only place in Chinatown that's older is the Nomois Tea Parlor, which is a dim sum place.
I started going to Wohop after Fanoclasts meetings in '64.
Yeah. Well, it's been there forever. When Lisa Eisenberg and I were dating, and we came back to her place one night, and her mother asked us where we'd been, and we said, "Oh, we just had a late supper at Wohop." And she said, "Oh, I used to go there in college, like in the 30s or 40s or something." So yeah, it's really an institution.
I wanted to read this. This is the 1966 Lunacon program, and it will tell you there is more commingling of fans than you'd think, because the 66 Lunacon was chaired by Charlie Brown. And the president of Lunarians was Frank Dietz, and secretaries Walt Cole. Treasurer was Marcia Brown. And the active members were John Boardman, Bell Dietz, Cindy Heap, Fred Lerner, Mike McInerney, Sam Moskowitz, Elaine Thorpes, me, Naomi Postal, Frank Prieto, Jacques Root, Milt Spahn, Jimmy Teresi, Ted White, Rich Brown, Harriet Kolchak, Joni Markwood, Chris Moskowitz.
These people were all on the committee?
No, these were the active members of Lunarians. So there's
Ah,
overlap in '66 between Fanoclasts and Fistfa and some of the other groups, and George Nims Rabin, Judy Sefton, Dave Van Arnhem, like I say, and so a
lot of the same ones. And it turns out that about 68, near the end of 68, there started to be a big split. I'm not sure if it was because Ted split with the Dietzes or something else, but at around that point, you start seeing quite a big difference. Van Arnhem, Stiles, everybody went off into Fanoclasts with Ted.
But
when was it that Dr. Christine Moskowitz sued Ted for
that was
libel?
back in the 50s. That was a long
Oh, okay,
time
it was a lot
before.
earlier. Okay. There's the floor pan.
I don't know if maybe Andy or
The 1968 Lunacon program book.
would like to explain about how in the old days, Lunacon was a one-day convention, and on the second day was EasterCon.
It was originally a one day, like 4 hours. It was just 4 hours. It was 4 or 5 hours, and in the front they had the program, and people sit in the middle, and in the back they had Bell Dietz selling muffins, and people selling books and stuff on the side. And it was initially just a one day, and eventually it became 2 days, and then it became a larger convention. But initially it was just, people just showed up at the door.
The first con I went to was, I think, 1970. Was that the year that Campbell was the guest of honor? And I actually got an autograph from Campbell. It was not too long before he died, because he died relatively young.
No, it was
and
1971.
Right, that's it. And the problem is that shiny surface does not, hold ink very well.
There.
But anyway, the friend who will go unnamed here, he did not have a long life in fandom anyway, was busy on Friday and Saturday, and he said, "I'm only free on Sunday, so I'll take you to the con on Sunday." And it never occurred to him to say, "Well, here's where the con is. Just go down and pay your money, and you can be there for the whole weekend." So I got half a day on Sunday, a small taste of Lunacon as my first convention experience. But it wasn't long before we were, Barry and I were going out of town conventions together, including the Worldcon in Boston in '71. So we didn't take long to get more deeply involved and spend the money and time to participate more fully.
That
was the first-
Worldcon, Moshe, was
Yeah.
actually my first convention, because Lee Smorey came up, and I stayed in contact with her after the protest in front of NBC, and she said, there's going to be a large science fiction convention. I was going to college in Boston at the time.
Oh, handy.
So we hooked up, and she brought me to the convention, and it was like Wonderland, because I've been reading science fiction my entire life.
Yeah. That was the first time I met Isaac's daughter, actually, and I did it in an awkward way because I couldn't resist. I didn't know who she was. It's this pretty girl on Isaac's arm, and so I made some crack about Isaac always having a pretty girl on his arm, not knowing it was his daughter. But he turned it around and made it a joke. He was okay with it, but I don't know what she thought. Later on, Harlan used to say that he would arrange a marriage. He thought I'd be a good match for her. I kind of wish he had tried it. Actually, it would have been interesting. She was pretty cute at least back then in '71. I don't know what she looks like now.
Like
None of
the
us are
rest of
cute
us,
anymore.
old and shriveled.
Well, no worse than any of us.
Well,
Silence.
as you were going along, who were the people you were excited to meet when you got into New York? Into New York fandom?
Well, I didn't have too many preconceptions about who I should.
No one knew. We didn't know. We didn't know who were the BNFs and who were
Right.
the obnoxious people. We didn't know Harriet Kolchak from Merrill.
Did Harriet Kolchak live in New York?
No, she was a member of Lunarians, but she lived in Philadelphia.
Okay, I thought that she was not a New Yorker.
No.
Okay.
Lunarians had members from quite a distance.
Yeah.
Jack Chalker used to drive up for monthly meetings
That's how I met him.
from Baltimore,
Yeah, that's how I met him.
wherever he was living down there.
He was in Baltimore. He was touting the wonderful advantages of his diesel-powered, I think it was a
Mercedes, was it?
Mercedes, yeah.
Yeah.
And he had another fuel tank installed in, so he could make the round trip drive without having to fill up.
Oh, I didn't know that. I want to make clear that even though I was never a member of Lunarians, I did attend a number of the meetings, both out at the Dietz's and then later at the Boardman's, for example.
But of course, Lunarians started it was 1750 Walton Avenue in the Bronx. And only when the South Bronx started to move north basically until it hit Yonkers, that they moved to Oradell. And also Frank got divorced from Bell, and then he married Ann Dietz.
Mhm.
They were doing that Luna publication. And
My strongest memory of visiting them in New Jersey was they had that IBM compositor, and I really wanted to play with it.
I used it for doing Elgol and for Science Fiction Chronicle, and it was an IBM. I think it was the MTS team. What you do is you you type everything in, and then it would automatically justify the thing and print everything out.
Yeah. Joe, the thing is that when you're in fandom, you're mingling with well-known fans and big name fans and not really thinking about them as, gigantic figures that you're eager to meet. You're only finding out that they're important maybe when you're going out of town and you see how they're treated in other places. I think most of us, if we had excitement about meeting anyone, it was meeting the pros. The first time I met Asimov, which was at the next Lunicon, I brought a bunch of kids with me from Queens College, where I had started the club. And there were a number of young ladies in the group. And we were standing in the elevator lobby at the hotel, at the Statler, I guess, upstairs. And Isaac came over, and I think it was because we had these girls there. And he ended up chatting with us for 15, 20 minutes. And I don't know if I didn't notice if he pinched anybody or kissed anybody. But it was a tremendous, exciting, big deal to us that Isaac was treating us so generously with his time. And then he remembered me when I met him again at the Worldcon. It probably didn't hurt that my name was Moshe. I was on a first name basis with him from then on, and going all the way to the years at the book club when he'd be visiting Doubleday, and he would always come over and say hi to me and Alan Asher. I could call him up at home. His number was in the phone book. I'm sure Andy understands that. He wasn't, even though he made a big thing out of what an ego he had, he actually was very approachable.
I was, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say the one thing, or one of the things I really enjoyed about science fiction fandom was that the pros, the authors, were very approachable. They were very personable. They'd sit around the convention suite, in their shorts and their stocking feet, and they would just swap stories. There was no egos, at least for the most part, but Harlan will exclude. But it was really an eye-opening experience that these were real people that were writing the stories that I was reading.
The big thing about Fandom was that Fandom didn't say, well, I'm an adult and you're just a 15-year-old kid, so you should shut up and listen to my wisdom. Yeah. They were treating you as an equal. And it was up, if you knew something and could impart information or was intelligent to talk to, they treated you as an equal. And this was not true in society at large. And it was an eye opener.
You took the words out of my mouth, Andy. I was just going to talk about that. Yeah. One of the things that struck me, I think it must have been that one of the first cons I went to. One of the prominent people in New York fandom who was mentioned in passing before was John Boardman, and John was a distinguished figure, a professor of physics, etc. And I saw him chatting with a kid, like 13, 14 years old. And they were talking as equals because they were equally knowledgeable about science fiction and fantasy, and that's what mattered. And I really loved that about fandom right away, that there was no age discrimination. And that's still something I value very much.
Well, I knew a lot of people already when I moved to New York. I met them at regional conventions, and I've been writing to their, writing letters of comment to their fanzines. So trying to put myself back in that mind frame of when I moved to New York. I don't remember being specifically excited about meeting any particular person, although I guess I would say I was excited about seeing them again. We hosted a party. I'm sure it was during the first year I lived in the Avocado Pit, and we had people from all sorts of corners of fandom there, some of whom hadn't spoken to each other in years and still weren't speaking, but they were in the same apartment. So I was kind of excited about, having Lee Hoffman and Charlie Brown in the same general space, even if they didn't like each other.
Yes. There were various groups throughout New York. You guys have mentioned some clubs. Just from when I was in New York for a few years, I remember there were clubs in Columbia, NYU, SFA, well, it's effectively New York, Queens, Fistfa, Fanoclasts, Lunarians. Were there others out there that any of you were involved with? I don't think the Star Trek group actually had a particular club.
No, there were clubs all over the country, but New York did not have a formal club with a leadership structure or anything.
Nothing like NESFA or LOSFIS. And ESFA was the Eastern Science Fiction Association, which was in Newark.
Right.
And they had monthly meetings at a Y there, and then everyone would traipse over to a nearby restaurant, I think at Childs initially, and have a meal and then disperse. And then they had something annually called the Open ESFA. So I have a membership.
Well, ESFA had been around for quite a while.
And what happened was when Newark went to hell in the 60s, ESFA pretty much basically shut down.
I think you took me to one meeting, Andy.
Afraid to go.
Big memory, but there were also clubs at two of the community colleges that I knew about, the Queensboro Community College and one in Brooklyn. There was that guy who who was a teacher there, and he had a Mimeo and an electronic stencil machine that I used a couple of times. I can't think of his name now. One of those MC type names, McRoberts or something like that. I can't remember now. Nice guy. Sorry, I can't remember his name.
Mimeo.
And the people at Queensborough College had community college had a professor there who was teaching science fiction courses, and she was also, coming to conventions and at least somewhat involved in fandom. We had a science fiction series of courses at Queens College as well, but our teacher I don't think she ever went to conventions as far as I know, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, it was fun to meet all these people from different groups. I wonder if any of you guys have any notion of why it was that the NYU group had this reputation for being, I'm not sure what the right word is, unpredictable, raucous, I don't know, silly, something not quite respectable. I mean, NYU was a good school. They can't have been, stupid kids who got in there, but there was something to the NYU.
No overlap, as far as I know, between those clubs and the Fanoclasts.
No, none at all. In fact, I think Fanoclasts looked down on the NYU group even more than we disdain.
I always thought that it was the vapors emanating from Washington Park.
Yeah, could be. I don't know. I mean, I got friendly with some of those people later on, and they seemed perfectly normal. just fannish craziness is like any of the rest of us. But for some reason, that group had a funny reputation there for a while of just being not troublemakers would be putting it too strongly, but just a little unpredictable.
Yeah, somehow. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I did go to an SFA meeting once. I think it must have been one of the open SFA meetings, and I went with probably went with Eli and David. But I remember very well because Willis Conover was the guest speaker.
Oh,
and he was very interesting. Of course, a large part of what he talked about was his friendship with H.P. Lovecraft, but he also talked about doing the Voice of America programs that he
right.
did.
Yeah.
So that memory is stuck with me. It's the only time I ever went to that. I did go to. I was a regular Fanoclast once I was approved. I think that Fanoclast got looser and looser about the original rules about being able to ban people. But I also went to Insurgents fairly often.
We banned Fred Phillips. And
can't really blame you there.
He was a talented but very annoying person in many ways.
Yeah.
I'm afraid to say.
Jim Sanders. Turns out Jim Sanders was at one time going to the library in, was it Baltimore? The free library in Baltimore, and stealing all their first edition mysteries and selling them to bookstores.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I don't think I knew Jim Sanders when I was in New York.
I know the name. I don't think I knew him.
I think he's on my friends list on Facebook, though. Hi, Jim.
I wanted to mention when Andy was reading the list of active members of Lunarians before, he mentioned Jimmy Tarathi, who was the most prominent fan in Flushing before me. And a few years ago, I actually tracked down the location of his home, which is now has since been torn down, but it's actually only about 2 miles north of me. And I'm sorry I never got to meet him.
He was a steam engineer for Con Ed, and in later years he blamed Fandom for everything that was wrong with his life in later years.
Really? Oh, he was so deeply involved. I mean, he was publishing his news scene
I actually had a column in it coming up in the prose. I would call up the various editors and stuff of the publishers and get a list of the paperbacks coming out, and it was in there in 60, 61, 62, something like that.
Yeah. I would have been interested in meeting him and hearing about early Queens fandom, but never had the opportunity. But because of the college club that I had started, we did at least have a little community of fans right here in Queens. Prominent among them was Stu Shiffman, of course, who went on to national fame or worldwide fame in fandom as a fan artist and writer. Eventually won the Hugo as a fan artist, and he only lived like about 10, 12 blocks from me. And then my co-editor and publisher on Placebo, Barry Smotroff, lived just across the other side of the Long Island Expressway from me. So it was just fantastic to have other fans, basically within a short bicycle ride. And that's not something I haven't had in a very long time. But we used to have, we continued the meetings during the summer when college was not in session. And so we got to be a pretty tight-knit group.
Was Singer part of your group?
No, Singer is with Eli's circle more. They knew each other in high school, so I think that's the connection there. Oh, I should have thought of making sure he knew about this. I forgot.
He's on.
He's on.
Oh, he's on. Oh, good.
He's listening right now.
Oh, good. So
Nice button chops, John.
I met
Say
him.
again, Andy?
I
Nice
met him
button
early
job.
on. I don't remember if it was at a Fistfa meeting or a Fanoclasts, but we've been friends a long time. And yeah, he and Eli were, go back a long way.
John drove me up to I gave a talk at University of Connecticut in Storrs once, and John drove me up, and then he was enthusing over their botanical collection, I believe.
Uh-huh. Well, he ended up going to college, I think, in Connecticut, didn't he? I mean, he was...
Graduate school for a little while.
Oh, was it graduate school? Okay.
Where I think it must have been where Bridget Dietz was attending school.
The Jeets.
I'm sorry, say again.
The Jeets
Dietz.
is the correct pronunciation. I think. Maybe John can correct me later if I got that wrong.
We'll be letting people kibitz a bit near the end of the panel, but
If I'm not mistaken, Bridget is with Ricky now, Ricky Kagan. So
Oh,
yeah, here's a little gossip for you.
well, thank you.
yeah, wanted to ask you guys a little bit. Fanzines have become less and less important, but you guys were doing, most of you were doing quite a bit in fandom, in fanzines. So you mind telling us some of the things you were doing there and what you were getting involved with, and what you think were some of the more interesting things?
I was U.S. agent for Ethel Lindsay and for John Bangson when Bangson was doing Australian Science Fiction Review, and Ethel was publishing Scottishy and Haverings in the UK. And I was trading my algal for all sorts of fanzines at the time. And I was getting a tremendous amount of fanzines. And as you know, Joe, you have my fanzine collection now. I gave it all to you, including, didn't I give you my entire complete set of AFA-F, which you should scan in real soon now before it.
Actually, no, that's something I did not get.
Did not get, no?
I'll take it.
Somebody else have it?
Complete set of AFA-F. I was
there
in
was
every
a time
single quote mailing, unquote.
There was a time I really wanted to inherit Andy's collection.
I was just mentioning
I
that,
didn't.
that my will, in my will, I give all my fanzines to Moshe, but the fact is that I don't have them anymore because I gave it to Joe and Edie.
That's okay. I forgive you because it just creates another obligation to make sure they survive me. And I don't know what I'm going to do with the ones I've already got, which is a pretty substantial amount. Somewhere along the way, I became a collector of fanzines as well as a publisher and writer in them.
Two words, Moshe, paper mache.
No, no. We have to find an East Coast institution that will take our fanzines, and so that there's
Joe Siclari,
yeah.
No, even Joe, bless his heart, is not going to live forever. And we have to have
That's for sure.
we have to have an institution that can guard them the same way they're being taken care of in the Midwest at Bowling Green or out west in California. There needs to be an East Coast equivalent of those.
Yes,
Well, there are a
suicide,
couple of institutions I
home of
can tell you about.
earthquakes and forest fires. What can go wrong there?
Well, you know, and Star Trek generated its own cottage industry of fanzines that went a bit beyond what the, you know, regular science fiction fanzines were. Like, they started out as just simply analysis of the show, the characters, but they eventually expanded out. And Linda, I see you're on, you worked with Deborah and Joyce on Poison Pen and some of those? No, you didn't. Okay.
I can tell you the amazing thing that in 1966, I had a letter about Star Trek in TV Guide.
Oh, that's cool.
I
And
had a-
for those
I had a
who have,
letter-
Head reporter, assistant editor, fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah. for those who have Star Trek fanzines, the University of, I believe it's Texas A&M, has a major archive and is trying to scan and save them all. And if you write to EDRI, we can send you an address for the person who is acting as an agent for them.
Now, that's great, but I think it would be a shame if all of that slash fiction got saved and none of our fannish writings were preserved. So we have
Well,
to.
that's what we're trying to do with.
It was
Nothing
it was
to
the
do.
B&D fanzines that really got the wide circulation.
There's all kinds of things, but the archive that we're doing on FANAC is supposed to, we are just about to hit 20,000 fanzines.
Yeah,
So-
your work in that area, and also Bill Burns
E-fanzines, right, with Bill Burns.
is very, very important, and because of that preservation aspect. And I can still remember when I was getting into fandom, it was just a challenge to track down the material to learn about the history, even to get, you know, the published books that were out, like Harry Warner's. And now all of that stuff is so readily available, and yet the younger fans don't really seem interested in taking advantage of it, which
Well-
I find very sad.
A few of them do, and we do what we can. So
Well, let's get back to the
get back to the
so-
publications. Jerry, why don't you talk?
I'm going to add one more Star Trek bit, though, is that when I attended Nikon in 1967, one of the things I did was to help collate the first issue of Spock and Alien. So that's my big Star Trek claim to fame. So
So did you sign your copy?
Did I sign my copy? I don't
Yeah,
remember. I don't
many
even
of those
have it any-
copies, many of those copies are signed by the collators.
Oh, I don't remember, and I don't have one anymore. So there.
And
Joe, you
No,
may
it's-
have one. You may have one that I signed if you go through them.
Ah,
it is online. So if anybody wants to look on fanac.org, you can find it.
Oh, okay. So although I started writing letters of comment to fanzines as soon as I started receiving them in late 1966, after the Tricon, and I wrote letters of comment and contributed some articles, columns, and poetry to them up until I continued to do it off and on, but up until 1974, I had not published my own fanzine, and in that year. I was one of the people who joined an amateur press association called CAPRA for short, or the Cinema Amateur Press Association, in order to chat about in print about movies. And so I started a fanzine for that, called The Spanish Inquisition, because no one ever expected me to do a fanzine. And then with the second issue, Suzel and I became co-editors, and then by the third issue, it was a
Leslie Luttrell, wow.
and it was a genzine, and I started an entirely different zine to contribute to the APA. So Span Ink we did until we decided to leave New York. So that was 74 through 77. We did 10 issues. We did one issue that was, we got invited to be guests of honor at Baltimore, and that was in 76. We didn't want to do speeches. I don't think people were really doing interviews of guest of honor yet, but we decided we would do a live version of the Spanish Inquisition, have people either write us stuff that we could read on stage, or if they could actually attend, they would read their articles. And we had artists doing stuff on an overhead projector to accompany. And then we had a few novelty items like Fref, juggling, and explaining about clown college in makeup. And Fred Kuhn sang an original song. Ginger Buchanan was one of our contributors, Lauren McGregor, other people, Dan Steffen and Wendy Limbo were our artists. So that material then got shoved into the next print issue of the Spanic.
It was a great time. It really can. It worked really well too.
Was that the first live fanzine?
To my knowledge, it
Yeah,
was.
I
And
think so.
and of course, when it was over, Ted White came up and said it was too long. That's all he said.
You can always
That's
rely
Ted.
on Ted for
It was too long. I agree, it was too long.
Yeah.
We didn't really time it well, and it came out to well over 200, not 200 hours, well over 2 hours, and our audience had shrunk from 400 to about 150 by the end.
Yeah, probably 90 minutes
Hardcore.
and as long as he
Yes.
should have.
But it was fun.
And you had Fresh before he was famous as a con man. So, that's something. Actually, you mentioned 74. We should also mention that Jerry created a new APA, a successor to APA F for Fanoclasts called APA Q, because at the time meetings were being held in Queens. And
But I decided it should be as anarchistic as the meetings themselves. So people should just bring zines and then collate their own copies. There was not supposed to be an official editor. However, Moshe, who likes order, who was very orderly, he kind of unofficially took over as unofficial editor.
yeah,
And he arranged for original cover art, and I think he also took care of mailing copies to people who were sending in contributions from out of town. And eventually you did a wonderful collection of covers from APAQ, because they were good. Ross Chamberlain, Stu Shiffman, and several other people did art on stencil for this, and they were really fun.
yes, you and I should take joint credit for a belated flowering of on-stencil art in APA Q that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. And some
the
of that
APA
work
continued. Yeah, the APA continued for years after I moved out of
Ford
New
took
York.
it over. Yeah,
It
but-
just ended about 2 years ago
oh, really? Okay.
during the pandemic, I believe.
I did not know that.
But
Mark
anyway,
Blackman took it over and had been sending it out electronically.
mhm.
Who I'm sorry, say again, who took it over?
Blackman.
Mark,
Oh, Mark
Mark-
Blackman.
yes.
Yes,
And-
Mark was one of those NYU SF people, as I remember it, along with Ira Donowitz, and I am having trouble remembering who was part of that group during the 70s.
Danny
So
Lieberman was one of them.
Okay. Later on, I
celebrity.
think Mark Richards and Velma Bowen were part of that group.
Maybe.
So working on APA Q got me interested in APA L. I actually became an out-of-town member of APA L for a while. So that added an extra small fanzine to my list. And I also was in FAPA for a while and interviewed Walheim on the 50th anniversary of the APA he had created. That's one of my lesser known important accomplishments. The other thing about the 70s that, of course, I remember with great fondness was the fact that not the Fanoclasts per se, but a group of fans with a large Fanoclast component put on a fan musical that I helped to write along with Eli Cohen.
And Debbie Notkin, I think.
Is it Debbie or Asimov? I can't remember now.
I believe it was Debbie.
Okay, Debbie. So, and we put it on at Flange in Pittsburgh in the mid 70s, and then it was so successful we did it again in Washington at Disclave with a slightly different cast, and then independently of us, it was put on in Minneapolis. So that's probably what makes it the most
It
successful.
was
Well,
a parody of the Music Man called the Minio Man, where everything in the Music Man was, as best we could, was turned into a fannish Perm or a fannish institution. And David Emerson, the reason that they were able to do it in Minneapolis was because
connection.
David
Yeah.
You gotta
had
know
been
your
the
duplicator.
lead, and he moved to Minneapolis, and he was the lead again.
Yeah, he's the star of all three productions. So
Susan Palermo was Marion the Librarian in the first production, and Faye Ringel, who's on the Zoom, was in the second production. I have no memory of who might have been the played the character in Minneapolis.
In the third production in Minneapolis, it was Susan Ryan.
oh, that's right. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Uh,
I knew he'd know that.
You know when there's a new production of The Music Man on Broadway right now, very good one, and I went to see it with some of the other people who were still around who were involved in the Mimeo Man, specifically Eli and Ginger. And Ginger was sitting next to me, and she made a point of telling me not to sing along. Which, you know, I had actually done the previous time I had seen it. I was doing it under my breath like 10, 15 years earlier when Lisa and I saw it on Broadway. But I didn't have a problem with that myself. But I happened to look over at her at one point and her lips were moving. So maybe she wasn't producing any sound, but she was definitely singing along silently.
She's a big fan of musicals.
Yeah, well, me too.
And as I recall, and I know I get the details wrong, but when we did the second production, it was at a hotel where we were sharing the hotel with a convention of barbershop quartets and whatever the female version of that is, I can't remember. But I believe it was Dolly Gilliland who was a member of both conventions, and she got a barbershop quartet for us to come and sing some of the material in the play. Sweet Adelines, thank you, David.
Yes, thank you, David.